Hey folks, I've got a box to open here, so let's see what's inside. So you guys of course will know what's inside this already from the video title description, but this is a new entry-level basic Federschwert, or essentially longsword practice weapon from the manufacturers in Italy, Arte Duellatorum, and we're going to open it up and have a look. So before I do, I'd just say that this is as an entry-level weapon. They do offer sort of customizations. They offer different hilt options and different blade options in terms of blade length and stuff like that. And this is the entry level at 180 euros. So very, very reasonably, extremely reasonably priced actually. So if you're getting your first Feder, or if you're buying lots of Feders for your club to run classes or whatever, and they are going to be bringing out other versions as well with stiffer blades and this kind of stuff as well. So let's have a little look inside and see what it's like. I'm quite excited about this. So here we go, nicely packed, simple but light packing, came straight to my door from Italy super quickly. Wrapped in bubble wrap inside. Here we go. Looks nice so far. Is that a oh. This is nice. I could actually do with a new Feder, so perfectly timed for me. Good, bubble wrap. Oh, it's got some plastic wrapped around here as well. So what I understand from the guys at Arte Duellatorum is that this is, as I say, it's an entry-level one, and this is relatively light and relatively flexible version. I understand that they're going to be introducing a so-called medium blade at some point relatively soon, which is going to be a bit stiffer, a little bit heavier. These days, since Feders became standard for longsword tournaments, for example, in my experience, Feders, it's funny, I think they started off being very light and flexible, I think almost as a reaction to trying to get away from reenactment type swords that tend to be very stiff and overweight. And since then they've kind of gone back a bit the other direction. There's been a tendency for Feders to get a little bit heavier and a little bit stiffer. Not everyone likes the heavy, and you can still get the lighter and more flexible ones, but I think that for most people, and this has certainly been my feeling, you do get some, if you're fencing against people with a variety of different Feders, if there isn't a standard Feder, then it just cancels out, of course, in that case. But if you're fencing against a variety of Feders, if you have a stiffer blade, and in some cases a heavier blade, and certainly if you've got a longer blade, it's an advantage. So if you're entering a tournament, you're allowed to use your own weapons, then using a stiffer blade is advantageous because it enables you to get a better bind on the opponent's blade and to come through with your point and get your point on. And if they try and parry you with a more flexible blade, it's less secure for them, and then their blade's more likely to flex out of the way as yours kind of comes through. So we've got some plastic wrapped around here, which is trying to resist my extraction. There we go. Okay, so it's peened at the end. I like the pommel, incidentally. It's quite flat, which is relatively unusual for Feders, actually. Feders often have cylindrical section pommels, and as you can see here, this is a flatter, almost like a sempak pommel. The wrap has got quite an old school look to it, actually. A lot of modern Feders have, I would say, quite modern looking grips, but this is, in a way, you could say it looks like tennis wrap, but it's actually leather. And it's actually got the edges of the blue leather kind of stick up a bit, which actually gives quite decent grip. Just poked my ceiling there, which doesn't matter because this is my garage. Yeah, so it's quite flexible. If we look at the flex of the blade, you can see that it stays stiff in the base for the first third or half, and it mostly flexes in the second half of the blade, which is what you want. That shows that doesn't really have much distal taper to speak of. I'll talk about that in a second, but it has a bit of profile taper. So in terms of the material in the blade, it's getting slightly less material as you go down here, which is what means that it flexes in the second half of the blade. The tip is a little bit on the small side, I would say. I would say if I was using that as a club weapon, I'll just bring it up here for you to see. If I was using that as a club weapon, I think I'd want to have something added around the tip of it. That's a little bit on the small and narrow side, I would personally say. I do personally prefer rolled tips. I know some people hate rolled tips, but I find rolled tips just give a slightly more forgiving tip in terms of stabbing my training partners regularly. What people don't like about rolled tips is they do sometimes break, particularly if you're taking them out of a sword bag and they get caught on something, they can crack off. So that is nice and strong, but maybe just a little bit on the small side, and it's kind of rounded at the top here, which actually makes it a bit more pointy than it needs to be. If it was squared off, maybe that'd be a bit more forgiving. So personally, I'd prefer for that tip to either be made a bit bigger or have something added around the end of it. In terms of the rest of the blade, it's nicely formed. It's I'd smack myself in the face with the. It's got a little bit of a wibble to the blade, so it's not perfectly straight. It's got a little bit of a wibble, but this is an entry-level feather, 180 euros. So I mean, presumably these are forged by the look of it. It looks like it's been hand forged. Yeah, fine. The thickness is quite thin, I would say. That's about 4 millimeters maybe here. So there's no distal taper that I can see. It's the same thickness here as it is here, but that's actually quite typical of feathers. Perhaps if you go to really high-end feathers, it's not true. They will have distal taper. But of the kind of entry level, kind of, let's say, budget feathers, that is completely normal to have a flat slab blade. And so long as you have silhouette or profile taper this way, and so long as they don't flex too much in the first half of the blade, then that's absolutely fine. In terms of the ease of flexibility, I wouldn't say it's especially flexible. So the guys at the company said that this was a very flexible blade. But it's not super flexible. I've known earlier Regnier feathers that were more flexible than this. Probably my first Regnier feather was more flexible than this. So yeah, I think it's fine. I don't think it's overly flexible by any means. I think a lot of people could use this very comfortably. In terms of how it moves, it's a little bit floppy, I have to say. Yeah, moving it like this, it does whip quite a bit. And I think that's part and parcel of the fact that it is quite a thin Hilt, and therefore quite a thin foot to the blade. So it's quite a wobbly blade in that sense. So that's interesting. So in a sense, it doesn't necessarily feel incredibly flexible when you thrust with it, but when you wiggle it, yeah, it is a bit whippy. And also what's interesting is and again, this is probably a product of being quite thin material here, when you do wiggle it like this, you do feel a little bit of flex in the grip, in the tang, because of course the tang will be the same thickness as the base of the blade here. The crossguard, very nice, quite thin, I have to say. So if we go here, they've removed quite a lot of material here, so it makes the crossguard very attractive and very light. But I'd be interested to see how that stands up to heavy use, either in a club or tournament sparring. It wouldn't surprise me if that bends quite easily, and my recommendation would to make that be a bit thicker. It looks nice and it makes the whole thing lighter, but for durability, I think longsword or feather crossguards get bashed a lot, and I'm a little bit concerned that that is too thin on that crossguard. So personally, I would say, guys, although this looks nice, I think it won't stand up to really heavy use. I think you want to keep the crossguard the same thickness that it is at the base here, at the intersection between the blade and where the tang goes through. I think you probably want to keep the same width all the way up to keep a bit more strength up here. Otherwise, I think there's going to be a lot of crossguards getting bent quite easily. In terms of the grip, I like the grip actually. I like the fact it's thin. Now, I know that a lot of people out there like a fatter grip than I do. I actually always like thin grips, whether it's a sabre or a longsword or anything else. That being said, my attitude, and when I've been designing swords with other companies, is always if you make the grip thin to start off with, a person can always wrap it to build it up to the thickness that they want with tennis wrap or whatever, twine or whatever they like. Whereas if you start with a grip that's too fat, they can't make it thinner without taking the grip covering off, working the wood down. It's just a lot of hassle. So I personally prefer thinner grip, and the other thing I would say is also with the big gloves that most people are using, maybe not with the sparring gloves because they've not got anything underneath, but if you're using something maybe like the Spez Heavies or something like that, you've got quite a big mitten underneath which adds width to your hand and to the grip anyway, so in that case you probably want a slightly thinner grip. But your mileage might vary, and some people do prefer fatter grips, but I think from a manufacturer point of view this is good. It's good to go for a thin grip to start off with. Perhaps in this case the only slight disadvantage is what I said about the wibbliness. I can feel that in the grip. It doesn't creak or do anything like that, it doesn't visibly bend, but I can feel there is a flex, there is a sympathy to the grip and to the tang moving inside it. And if the grip was maybe a little bit thicker, maybe you wouldn't feel that so much. In terms of the pommel, I really like the shape of the pommel a lot, actually. For me personally, that's much more my cup of tea, to use a very English expression, than the standard pommels you find on a lot of feathers out there. That's shaped like a scent stopper or Sempak type pommel, and I really like that type of pommel, almost a fishtail. And it's peened at the end, so there's no nut or anything like that. It's just peened in a traditional way. All seems absolutely solid and sound. One other thing I'd mention as well, they very nicely cut the slot there for the tang through the guard. It's very well fit, and it's got a nice bit of grinding each side, so it really seats down in there and actually looks quite like a real sword. So I like the cross guard aesthetically, and it's all solid and everything, but I'm worried about it being too thin there, and I strongly suspect that in use those are going to get bent and that needs fattening up. So I would personally say, in an ideal world, I would use slightly thicker stock for the blade to start off with. So rather than 4mm, if it is 4mm, I haven't measured it, but I'd use maybe 0.5 mm or 1 mm thicker, and ideally have a bit of distal taper, but that would increase the cost. For an entry-level feather, I think this is good. For 180 euros, you know, difficult to beat at that price, really. And yes, it's a little bit floppy. I do think if they're going to bring a medium blade, so I know that they're going to bring a medium blade, so a stiffer blade version out, I think that will probably be what most people prefer. And if it is a bit more expensive, I don't know whether it will be, but if it's a bit more expensive, I suspect that most people, unless you're buying lots of these for a club, most people will probably choose the slightly more expensive option to get that slightly stiffer blade, and I think they'll probably prefer that. But in terms of the hilt construction and the finish, the fit and finish and everything, very, very nice. I would only say I would personally prefer that tip to be a little bit bigger and perhaps a little bit flatter. But thank you very much for sending this. The Arte Duellatorum, obviously linked below to their website, and yeah, very nice, very good. I haven't used it yet. Obviously, our training is not back on yet. We're still in lockdown as far as HEMA training is concerned. But as soon as I can, I will give this a test, and I'll do an update then to how it's standing up to actual use, maybe show some videos of people using it. Might be me, might be someone else. But first impressions, there we go. Very nice budget entry-level feather from a relatively new manufacturer that some of you won't have heard of yet. So go and check out their website now. Thanks for watching, see you really soon, and take care.